In the 1930s, it seemed like the Western world was ending. For a decade straight, America had been in a frenzy. Growth was up, the stock market was booming. New inventions rolled out of labs like Menlo Park every day. Electrification was lighting up the night skies, and it was set to the soundtrack of a new and unique American jazz music, wild and chaotic like the country itself. They called it the Roaring Twenties. But what is often forgotten was the monstrous side that roar represented. Opulence in the cities hit extreme poverty and wage slavery in the countryside. The new high culture of jazz hid the stirrings of race war and clans war as Klansmen, anarchists, gangsters, and revolutionary socialists battled it out in the streets across the country. And the prosperity was unnatural. It was a frenzy of spending fed by cheap credit and the insane overconfidence of a people who saw the stock market as their own personal roulette table. The Roaring Twenties were a binge in more ways than one, and after the binge had to be a crash. And it crashed hard. On Black Monday of 1929, the Dow Jones Industrial Average plummeted by a full 13%. Within a year, it would be at 1/10 its old levels. Panic spread like wildfire through Wall Street and into the banking system. As stock prices collapsed, businesses collapsed. As businesses collapsed, banks collapsed. And when the banks collapsed, they took the life savings of everyone who had trusted them, rich and poor alike. No Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation existed at this time. When people lost it, they lost it for real. As the financial system melted down, Chernobyl style, industry began to teeter, with 1 in 4 Americans losing their jobs, forced to shelter themselves in shanty towns called Hoovervilles, and feed themselves from the hand of welfare and soup kitchen lines. But something was different this time. There had always been recessions before, but the recessions had generally been short and small, and often very self-contained. This one hung around. It was as if the machinery of the market had broken, or the life had been snuffed out of it. Here there was tons of capital and labor lying unemployed, and yet no one was there to employ it. There were goods unsold on the shelves, and yet customers unable to buy them. The world had been turned upside down. And then the earth itself seemed to turn on the people. The Great Plains looked around, said, "Fuck this," and lifted off to go find greener pastures. One of the largest mass migrations in this nation's history ensued, as the American farmer, the Okie, was forced to leave for California, or very literally choked to death on clouds of the soil they had recklessly plundered. The American Congress reacted with selfishness and short-sightedness, hoping to pass on our misery to some other country. They passed extremely harsh tariffs on all of our trade partners to protect our jobs. And what did the rest of the world do? They retaliated with like measures. Nobody's jobs were protected, with everyone's trade being taxed into the ground. And international trade, one of the pillars of international peace, plummeted to a third of its old level. And not every nation was as fit to handle it as us. The communists had already emerged in Europe and Asia, as the warlike Soviet Union and the insurgent Chinese. And around the world, folks were terrified. They sold their souls to the devil and tried to find refuge in other extremist ideologies, demagogues that would promise to fix everything and protect them. The model was Mussolini's Italy, and the new acolytes would be the weakest, most vulnerable democracies in the Great Power Club: Germany and Japan. And throughout the 1930s, the Germans and the Soviets would wage brutal Cold War on each other, turn countries like Spain into ash. before the real killing of World War II. As far as the Western business elite could tell, they were living through the end times, if not of humanity, then of the democratic capitalist way of life. It seemed as though Karl Marx had been proven right, that capitalism was finally destroying itself in one last spectacular crisis, that the internal contradictions of that system could be managed no longer, and the system itself was broken, and the poor and dispossessed of society would have to step in and take over, or some higher authority would have to smash them back down into the dirt. Now, the communist system was built on a mountain of corpses. The Soviets starved their people to death so they could sell the grain to buy machines. But corrupt Western news media spun stories of opulence. And the fascist system was built on fraud and theft, requiring there to always be another country or minority to fleece. But Western industrialists and bureaucrats liked the idea of a rule by technical expert. There was a specter haunting Europe, the specter of communism, but also the specter of fascism, of Nazism, of socialism, international or national, and totalitarianism in all its forms. A belief that people cannot manage their own affairs and that all power must be given over to one single party, to one single almighty government. But then came onto the scene a self-appointed hero, ready to go to battle with the ghost. Whoops. It was Lord John Maynard Keynes, superstar economist in His Majesty's service. Keynes came from a British civil service background and had a reputation for being the man who saw things clearly when everyone else had a bad idea. He'd proven that back in the Treaty of Versailles, when he made the argument for treating defeated World War I Germany with mercy. He was also a hot-blooded man. Like some British super spy, aristocratic Keynes was a hard drinker who slept with every woman, or man, he swung both ways, he could get his hands on. He was an art collector who was comfortable hobnobbing with the cultural elite of his day, like the Bloomsbury Group, and mugging for the cameras. In a lot of ways, he was, in his very hedonistic personal conduct, a perfect symbol for the 20s. But he had a powerful intellect capable of taking on the challenges of his time. There are many different theories of the business cycle. Lord Keynes, however, will be our main focus because he was sort of the father of macroeconomics in the same sense that Adam Smith was the founder of microeconomics, and because his theories, likewise, would go on to be refined and synthesized with others to create what is now called the new consensus that is taught in most universities. However, we will also consider the much more free market Austrian school theory that was developed as a criticism of Keynesianism. So, before we begin, I imagine that many of you already have at least a vague awareness of what the business cycle means, but for those of you who don't, just a quick introduction. The business cycle refers to an empirical regularity that economies tend to grow and shrink like a wave function. We expect economies to expand and to decrease, and they tend to do so in a sort of pattern. It's not perfectly predictable. There are many financial gurus and macroeconomists who make a living out of trying to do this. They tend to do a pretty bad job of it. Predicting fluctuations in the market is kind of like trying to predict the weather. People tend to blame you when you get it wrong more than they credit you when you get it right. And it's inherently difficult because you're dealing with very chaotic subject matter. But on the whole, we do know that it tends to kind of go like that. And provided rule of law, most economies will grow over time, at least in the modern world. We'll talk about this more in Unit 4, where we go into one aspect of growth economics. Usually the upswings are larger than the downswings. So it's not exactly a wave function like, say, a heartbeat like you see on TV with the medical machines, but it's more of a snake climbing a ladder. Now, when economies shrink, we refer to that as a recession. And particularly severe recessions are called depressions. How do you distinguish a recession from a depression? Who cares? I actually make a point in this course that I try to avoid giving you what I consider to be useless or arbitrary definitions or useless or arbitrary jargon. People will quibble over, oh, are we in a recession? Are we in a depression? Is the GDP growth rate like low enough? It's the same as with hyperinflation. For all practical purposes, the difference between the two is that a depression is longer, it's more sustained, and it's just much more intense. It's not as though if your GDP growth rate was 1% lower or higher, that would significantly change the quality of life for people. Personally, I like the take of one of my own micro professors here, Bill Dugan. Professor Dugan had this little witticism. He would say, it's a recession if your neighbor loses his job. It's a depression if you lose your job. Now, hopefully you get what he means. It's a depression when you lose your job because enough people are losing their jobs that it's something that affects you personally. It's not just something that you only know about because you heard it on the news. Now, we don't have any special term for periods of growth. I'm going to try to just call them growth to be consistent. Oftentimes, you will hear dramatic growth called a boom, and very massive booms will be called miracles. And the funny thing about miracles is that they're not miraculous in the slightest. They used to be because we didn't used to know why they happened. But enough miracles happened over time that growth economists eventually pretty much figured it out. It turns out that very, very rapid growth is easy if you're starting out behind. But you'll hear more about that in Unit 4. Japan, Germany, Spain, and China are all some particular famous countries that have had booms. But, we're not going to be talking about the upswings so much in this section. It's the downswings that we really care about. Because really, when you get down to it, the downswings are they're normal in how they regularly come up, but they're abnormal in the sense that we don't want them to happen, right? It'd be like talking about good health versus bad health. Is it really all that interesting to study what makes someone healthy as opposed to studying the diseases that make them unhealthy? Health, in some sense, could just be said to be the absence of illness. Down in this lower corner, you see the GDP growth rate over time for the United States. So you've got recessions every time it's going down. You have growth every time it's going up. And you notice, like, there's no exact pattern. If you were to try to predict that off of it, you couldn't do it. But you know that it happens often enough that there's always going to be a recession sooner or later. Now, as I told you in the introduction, we're going to be talking about Keynes. I Normally, in past semesters, this is also where I talk about Marxist crisis theory a bit, but I'm leaning towards adding on an extra lecture where basically I'm just going to move Marx's version of the business cycle into my Marxism material. And I might assign that to you in advance, but you will have known if I did that, by the time you watch this. We'll be talking about Keynes because Keynes is the main man in economics. There were later economists there were earlier economists who had their own theories. There were later economists who disagreed with him, most notably Milton Friedman. We're going to focus on him and on his most significant detractor, Hayek. But that doesn't come up until the very end of the unit because Hayek is essentially picking apart everything wrong with Keynesianism. So you can't really understand him until you understand Keynes. And understand, too, that like with most of the stuff I show you in this class, this is a very simplified version of his theory. I had Keynesianism in intermediate macro back when I was in college, and we had crazy shit where we'd have to look at like 4 different graphs all at once and read off of them. As usual, I'm cutting this down to pretty much the bare minimum to convey the idea. Okay, so what does Keynes teach? Well, Keynes' idea begins with supply and demand, but we're doing macroeconomics, not microeconomics. He doesn't want to look at supply and demand of a single market at a single time. He wants to look at the entire economy over time. Now, what do our supply and demand curves show? What they show is the relationship between the price of the good and how much people want to buy or sell, respectively, at that given price. Well, how can you define quantity and price when you're talking about everything? Well, conveniently, and this is another reason why I teach this after inflation, we already kind of have a basis for this idea in how we measure inflation. Right? You remember back to the inflation lecture, I told you how the way you do it is you create a sort of bundle of goods. You imagine like a typical shopping cart that someone would buy over, say, a week or a month of shopping, and then you track changes in the price of that. So in Keynes's supply and demand model, the good is going to be the bundle of everything, and the price is going to be the price level. And then, if we're talking about changes over time, because Keynes doesn't care about solving for equilibrium, he doesn't care about analyzing the long-term effects, he's all about the cycle. He's about how are things changing moment to moment. Well, then we're going to need to be looking at change over time and not just stagnant levels. So what would the change in the quantity be? That would be the real growth rate. It says growth rate there. That's a mistake on my part. Mentally substitute in real with just about everything we're doing. And what would the change in the prices over time be? The inflation rate. And he's going to call his supply and demand aggregate supply and aggregate demand to distinguish it from microeconomics. Pretty much all of your supply and demand analysis, and I hope you do remember it. You kind of should. We talked about it through all of Unit 1 and 2. But pretty much all of that analysis is going to carry over. So this should be very simple and familiar to you. Let me put it this way. Macroeconomics is a lot easier to learn than microeconomics, but it's a lot harder to do as an economist. Like I said, macroeconomists don't have a good track record of making accurate predictions, but that's because their job is just plain harder than microeconomists. I'm both. I don't have a dog in this fight. Now, also coming back from inflation, remember this identity, MV equals PY? What essentially told us that the money supply, so money times velocity, money times how often you use it, has to equal the GDP, how much money is being spent. Well, if the left side is growing, then the right side must be growing by the same amount, correct? But the right side could be growing because P, the price level, is growing, or it could be growing because Y, real output, is growing. Now, in the long term, right? In the long term, money is neutral. In the long term, you know that real output cannot change. But in the short term, it could be either one of these. And so the aggregate demand is going to be the set of all combinations of inflation rate and real growth rate that can equal a given growth rate of the money supply. And this should become a little more clear with a graph. So you see over here, at this level, the money supply is growing by 5%. Presumably, we're talking about the modern world. So fiat currency, you have the mint, right? Or the Federal Reserve is, oh, I haven't talked about the Federal Reserve yet, have I? Comes up in a few lectures. The government is printing up cash, and they're printing it at such a rate that the money supply grows by 5% over whatever period we're talking about. Now, we know that when they do this, that money enters circulation, and it has to either go into rising prices or into rising output. So what are the different combinations of inflation and growth that will make that true? Well, one way could be if all of it was growth. So all of that money gets put into more production. And in that case, you'd have 5% growth and 0% inflation. Or you could have more of a mix. You could have 3% growth and 2% inflation. Or it could all be inflation with no growth at all. And then we even see some other scenarios. On this graph, for example, you can have minus 2% growth and 7% inflation. The economy is actually getting smaller, but it's inflating by so much that you still have a positive increase in the money supply. One thing to understand, like one thing that I probably should have pointed out in the text is supply and demand pretty much had to be in that positive, the friggin' camera's mirrored. In that, positive quadrant, right? You have your x-axis, your y-axis. Whenever we talked about microecon, we were always playing around in this area because negative prices don't make sense and negative quantities don't make sense. You could totally have a scenario where that does make sense, but like in normal day-to-day life, that's not going to happen. But when we're talking about inflation and growth, they can be negative. So that opens up all this other space. What's negative growth? Well, again, that's just called a recession. You're getting smaller instead of bigger. And what's negative inflation? Why, that's deflation, right? Prices are going down. Now, like I said, in the long run, money is neutral. In the long run, Y cannot change just because you screw around with MV. Once the money has fully circulated, all of the opportunity costs are restored back to their true values. Printing up more money does not magically create more workers. It doesn't magically create more factories. It doesn't magically change the production technologies you have. And so in the long run, the growth rate is going to be some fixed amount. It is as though you have a perfectly inelastic supply. And at the point where the long run aggregate supply and the aggregate demand intersect, you are going to get an equilibrium. So I'll point that out to you here. So like, for example, here now it's say 10% money supply growth. And at that market's equilibrium, it's 3% real GDP growth, 7% inflation. Probably not a desirable scenario. And because long run aggregate supply is perfectly inelastic, any shock to aggregate demand will change the inflation rate, but it will not change the real growth rate. Right? Just like how if you have a perfectly inelastic supply in microeconomics, the quantity is what it is. The producer cannot change the amount they make, and so they have to accept whatever price will clear the market. So, if aggregate demand were to go up, then you would find that people are willing to pay more for a good. They're willing to pay more for a good, but no more of it can be made. The economy is already at its full potential. It's at its maximum size. And so all of that extra spending has to be represented by an increase in inflation. Likewise, if aggregate demand were to fall, well, producers don't want to be stuck with unsold goods, and they're going to accept whatever price they have to sell them off. And so the inflation rate will decrease. It will, as we say, disinflate. If it goes negative, it deflates. But the real growth rate stays unchanged. Now, by itself, aggregate demand and long-run aggregate supply are not interesting. There is nothing of value to be drawn from that. But where it gets interesting and where the business cycle comes in is through the short-run aggregate supply. See, remember how I taught you that when money first enters circulation, it causes a sequence of positive demand shocks. And each shock raised the quantity supplied because the equilibrium in that individual market moved. And because of that, inflation does increase production in the short term. You are willing to pay more for a good. The producer is willing to hire more resources to build a bigger factory, hire more workers, put more land under the plow to make whatever good it is you need in the short term. Because it's only in the long term that the prices of all these factors of production rise and they realize it's not worth it. There's always slack resources like that you can develop. It's been a long time since I was working on these recordings, so I apologize if I've already used this example with you. But one way of thinking about it is you might imagine something like a boom town. Like back in the Old West, you'd have your boom towns around railroads, around prospectors' camps. Everyone floods into a place at once. And when that happens, it attracts a lot of other businesses too. You get like your saloons, you get your Chinese laundries, you get, different businesses that crop up just to support the people who are there. But those businesses are only sustainable as long as there's an elevated level of production, as long as all that other commerce is there too. Well, likewise, when this money enters circulation, it will make certain business models that are not otherwise profitable. The customers are buying your stuff, it's worth it to make it. But it can't last forever. It's only because the prices are still lower than they should be that they're able to do this. Now, in equilibrium, the producer expects an inflation rate equal to the current inflation rate. Most of our economic models do assume that at least businessmen, if not everyone, are capable of accurately predicting this stuff. And like any positive demand shock or imposition of a tax, part of the increased, actually, this would be a subsidy, wouldn't it? Part of the increased spending will become higher inflation, and part of it will become higher output. So here you see at our initial equilibrium, all three intersect. The long run aggregate supply and the short run aggregate supply have to cross, and the aggregate demand has to cross too. But something happens. Something causes the aggregate demand to move. People want to spend more money. More money is being created, and it has to get spent somehow. And so people start bidding up prices. Quantity goes up, but the prices also go up. And thus you have growth. Short-term growth, unsustainable growth. Now, eventually, the currency fully circulates, and the producers revise their expectations of inflation rates. Now the producer says, okay, I understand. I've seen what happened. I saw that this gold mine opened up. I saw that the government started printing money. I know that these high prices are here to stay, and I know that I'm not actually getting as good of a deal as I thought. And so I'm going to cut back. And what happens is the short run aggregate supply shits. Whenever the aggregate demand increases, it triggers later on a negative short run aggregate supply shock. And what do negative supply shocks do? Well, they reduce the quantity and they increase the price. So as inflation rises, as the money fully circulates, and as neutrality of money begins to take over, the producers start to back off. Growth falls, but inflation goes even higher. The initial injection of money into the economy or the initial increase in spending. Keep in mind, banks are also creating money when they make loans, right? So it doesn't have to be that the government introduces more money. It could be that there's an increase in consumer demand for credit. But however the money is being introduced, when it is, the demand goes up, but the positive demand shock sets up a negative supply shock that's going to be just large enough to get us back to the long run aggregate supply. This movement here is going to necessarily trigger this movement here. And so you move from A to B, and you move from B to C. The economy expands, and then it contracts. But as it does so, the prices creep up the entire time. And you can think of it as like taking a breath. And this is to a large extent what a Keynesian business cycle can look like. Growth, release, over and over and over again. Now, this can work just as well in reverse. Like if we were to talk about a negative aggregate demand shock. So if aggregate demand were to fall, if spending levels were to fall, or if the money supply were to fall, it would have a ripple effect of negative demand shocks throughout the economy. demand falls for one product, which means that the producers of that product have lower incomes, which means that demand falls for all those goods that, those producers consider to be normal, and on it goes. You have a multiplier with it. And there's a special term for this. Economists like to call this the paradox of thrift. It's a paradox because in our own personal lives, in our own personal finance, or home economics, if you prefer that term, the way you save is by not spending. Yet for an economy as a whole, a reduction in spending can actually cause a reduction in savings. Because if people are not spending, they're not generating profits for the businesses they deal with, which means that they have less to save. And on it goes. Your spending is someone else's income. And so your savings reduce other people's incomes. And if everyone's thinking this way, you get potentially a very large reduction caused by a very small personal reduction. Now, that negative aggregate demand shock, you want to plot this out on a graph, it does the reverse of the positive aggregate demand shock, right? Positive demand shocks raise the quantity and raise the price. So negative demand shocks lower the quantity and lower the price. And if we're talking macroeconomics here, that means the growth rate falls. In this scenario, you see it falls so much it goes negative into recession. And the inflation rate falls, it disinflates. If it was big enough, it would have deflated. The aggregate demand falls, people don't want to spend as much, or they don't have the money to spend as much. And so producers have to accept lower prices to sell off their goods. I thought I had included another chart after that, but I can draw one for you easily. What's going to happen afterwards, though? Well, as the prices fall, producers begin to find that they can produce more cheaply. Initially, they didn't want to produce as much because they weren't getting as good of a price. Well, in this case, you're not really circulating more money, you're circulating less money. As prices fall across the board, as production becomes more affordable, producers say, hey, I can produce more at this cost. It's worth it to me to produce more. And so supply starts to go up. The short run aggregate supply increases. And what do positive supply shocks do? They raise the quantity and they lower the price. Again, just like a reverse of the negative demand shock. Sorry, of the positive demand shock. The positive demand shock caused a negative supply shock so that you get growth, contraction, and prices driven higher. The negative demand shock caused contraction, growth, and the prices driven lower. In both cases, a demand shock triggers its opposite supply shock so that the long run growth rate doesn't move. But the effect on prices in both are reinforced. I will have a handout summarizing this. We got a kind of quick summary here.